Picture Moscow at the bleeding edge of a new century. The year is 1900. Gaslight still flickers in the alleyways, but iron and ambition are rewriting the skyline. Smokestacks punch through the morning fog. Railroad tracks spider outward from the city's heart like veins feeding a body that can't stop growing. This is Russia's industrial moment, raw, loud, and absolutely convinced of its own modernity. And right in the middle of that chaos, a new railway station opens its doors. Pavletsky. The official story is clean, almost boring. Architect Alexander Krasovsky. Construction period 1897 to 1900. Purpose: a standard passenger terminal connecting Moscow to the southern industrial centers. Red brick facades, iron trusses, decorative stonework, all the familiar signatures of late 19th century Russian railway design. On paper, it's exactly what you'd expect. But paper has a habit of lying by omission. There's a photograph. It surfaces from the Moscow Railway Engineering Archive. Dated 1902, taken during the station's inauguration ceremony. At first glance, it looks like any other commemorative shot dignitaries in dark coats. A crowd gathered beneath an impressive vaulted entrance. But look closer. The vaulted ceiling above those assembled heads displays radial symmetry so precise, so mathematically clean, that it seems to exceed every mechanical capability documented for the period. This isn't the kind of craftsmanship you'd expect from steam-powered cranes. Timber, scaffolding, and manual hoists. This is something else. And beneath the platforms, half swallowed by shadow, sits a sealed iron hatch corroded on the surface, yet structurally intact, as though whoever built it expected it to endure not decades, but centuries. Now, if you clicked on this video because the title made you wonder how ancient trains could have possibly worked without coal, steam, or electricity good, that question is exactly where we're headed. And the answer is stranger than you think. So, do me a favor, if this kind of mystery hooks you the way it hooked me, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from right now and what time it is there. And if someone you know loves a good historical rabbit hole, send them this video. Trust me, they'll thank you for it. All right, let's keep going. Using photogrammetric analysis software and scaling against known architectural elements visible in that photograph, researchers have estimated the dimensions of the foundation blocks supporting that entrance. Each one appears to weigh between 3 and 4 metric tons, quarried from granite, and positioned with tolerances calculated at under 3 millimeters. To put that in perspective, that's a level of precision that would challenge modern construction teams equipped with laser-guided equipment. In turn of the century Russia, the standard construction equipment documented in engineering journals from the 1890s, the hoists, the scaffolding, the hand-operated cranes couldn't have managed anything close. The workforce would have needed mechanized lifting assistance that no Moscow construction company possessed at the time. Yet there those blocks sit, perfectly aligned. Their joints so impossibly tight that the mortar between them seems almost ceremonial. It's the kind of result that, in strict technical terms, shouldn't exist. And then there's the alignment. This is where things start to feel less like architecture and more like something nobody's supposed to notice. Pavletsky Station sits along an axial corridor that corresponds, with uncomfortable accuracy, to routes indicated on 18th century maps produced by French and Dutch cartographers between 1760 and 1820. Those maps don't label that territory as Russia. They label it Tartaria, vast stretches of Siberia, Central Asia, and chunks of Eastern Europe, all depicted as belonging to a civilization that appears on European atlases for over a century before vanishing from later cartography without explanation. The station's precise north-south orientation coincides with grid nodes connecting settlements documented on those historical maps. Settlements whose infrastructure predated Russian imperial expansion by generations. At first, it's tempting to call this coincidence. Plenty of buildings face north. But when the measurements keep matching not approximately, but with the kind of precision that implies deliberate coordination, coincidence starts to feel like the laziest explanation available. So what do we actually have here? A station built at the dawn of the 20th century, officially attributed entirely to Russian industrial-era engineering, whose foundation stones were placed with tolerances that surpass documented period capabilities, whose vaulted entrance displays mathematical symmetry that the available tools shouldn't have produced, whose geographic alignment echoes spatial patterns laid down on maps centuries older and, in some cases, thousands of kilometers distant from Moscow, and beneath it all, sealed behind corroded iron, chambers and hatches that nobody in authority has ever seemed particularly eager to open or explain. The dome crowning the central waiting room deserves its own attention. Krasovsky's blueprints describe it as a decorative feature for passenger comfort, a nice architectural flourish following European railway conventions. But the proportions of that dome, its perfect curvature and measured radius, reflect engineering knowledge that the official construction timeline doesn't acknowledge. Some architectural researchers have noted that these proportions appear on structures in territories those same 18th century cartographers marked as independent Tartary, not Russian, not European, something older and, if the physical evidence is any guide, something considerably more sophisticated than the official story wants to admit. Here's the thing that nags. If Pavletsky Station were purely a product of its documented era, if Krasovsky and his team built the whole thing from scratch, using the tools and knowledge available in 1897, then every anomaly should have a straightforward explanation. The precision should match known capabilities. The alignment should be irrelevant. The sealed hatch beneath the platform should be nothing more than an old drainage cover. But the physical evidence keeps refusing to cooperate with that tidy narrative. The measurements don't fit. The craftsmanship exceeds what the tools could deliver, and that iron hatch, corroded on the outside, structurally sound beneath, sits there like a locked door that someone very deliberately chose never to reopen. The official record says this is a railway station, built by Russians, for Russians, at the turn of a confident industrial century. And maybe that's true, but the stones tell a different story, or at least, they whisper questions that the archives have never bothered to answer. What's beneath Platform 3? Who sealed that hatch? And more importantly, why did no one ever unseal it? And if the foundation geometry of a 1900 train station echoes patterns from maps drawn 150 years earlier, depicting a civilization the history books quietly stopped mentioning, what exactly are we standing on? That question hung in the archive's silence, unanswered. And it was only the first trace. Every old building has secrets, loose floorboards hiding love letters, bricked-up fireplaces nobody remembers closing. But there's a difference between a house forgetting its own history and a public railway station actively burying it. Somewhere in the bowels of Pavletsky Station, filed in a box labeled Platform Drainage Systems, 1910 to 1915, a maintenance log from a 1912 renovation tells a story the official record clearly never wanted told. The entry is terse, almost aggressively uninformative, referencing what the engineers called a sub-level chamber, housing mechanical elements of unknown original function. Not broken elements, not outdated elements. Unknown. The crew documented that the chamber was sealed per municipal directive and that they were unable to determine the apparatus's purpose. Then, apparently, everyone moved on. No follow-up investigation. No engineering curiosity. Just a directive from somewhere above. And silence from everyone below. But the chamber didn't disappear just because someone stamped a form. Photographs from that same renovation period show faint iron fittings protruding from brick walls, valve assemblies, and pressure relief mechanisms whose design matches nothing in any industrial catalogue from the era. The metalwork exhibits unusual uniformity, as if cast using techniques considerably more advanced than hand-forging methods typical of early 20th century Russian foundries. Hand-forged iron from that period carries telltale signatures, visible grain irregularities, carbon content variations. The imperfections that come from human hands working hot metal, these fittings don't have those imperfections. They're too clean, too consistent, too precise for what documented technology should have produced. If the equipment available in 1900 couldn't have made these fittings, then who did and when? Imagine descending a maintenance stairwell closed to public access, past the noise of the platforms above, down into the kind of quiet that swallows sound. The chamber sits exactly where the 1912 documents indicated a rectangular void, approximately 4 meters by 5, lined with brick masonry, showing none of the deterioration you'd expect from century-old construction exposed to Moscow's aggressive groundwater. The walls form a perfect square, aligned to within 0.2 degrees of true cardinal directions. That's precision remarkable by any standard. Ancient or modern, the brick joints? So precise they appear machine-cut, each course level within millimeters across the entire span. Contemporary Russian industrial journals from the 1890s never described hydraulic chambers beneath passenger stations. Drainage tunnels, sure, but nothing with this level of geometric intention. This chamber wasn't built to manage rainwater. It was built for something else entirely. Something that whoever sealed it decided the world didn't need to know about. Following the chamber's alignment on early cartographic materials, specifically 18th century maps, labeling these territories as Tartaria, a correspondence emerges with ancient canal and hydraulic corridors that once reportedly linked settlements across the Eurasian steppe. The alignment is specific enough to suggest whoever designed this chamber was working within a larger system extending far beyond a single Moscow railway station. The physical evidence suggests it had been deliberately decommissioned, its original purpose erased from record but not from physical reality. Someone shut it down, bricked it up, and filed the paperwork where nobody would think to look. That's not neglect, that's policy. Now move upward into the main waiting hall and consider the dome overhead. According to Krasovsky's 1899 blueprints, it measures 18 meters in diameter and serves a purely ornamental function, decorative feature, passenger comfort. But photographs from 1903, taken during routine maintenance, revealed details the blueprints conveniently omitted. Hidden behind decorative plasterwork were iron reinforcement ribs, far heavier than ornamental architecture could possibly require. Construction photographs show massive I-beams, each weighing an estimated 800 kilograms, arranged in a radial pattern, suggesting structural loads far exceeding what a decorative dome would need to bear. The engineering doesn't look decorative. It looks defensive, almost fortified, as if designed to contain internal pressure or absorb mechanical stresses having nothing to do with keeping rain off commuters' heads. Here's where the dome gets genuinely strange. Measurements of its curvature reveal dimensions nearly identical to star-fort domes documented in 19th century military surveys of Central Asian fortifications, structures in territories that French and Russian atlases from the 1780s labeled Independent Tartary. Star forts weren't train stations. They were military installations engineered for resilience, designed to withstand siege conditions. Why would a passenger railway dome in Moscow share precise geometric proportions with fortified structures thousands of kilometers east, in territories belonging to a civilization the historical record barely acknowledges. The radial alignment of supporting arches also mirrors geometric patterns rarely attributed to 19th-century Russian architects, who typically favored Byzantine or Baroque proportions. Something else informed this design, something older. And then there's the corridor, a sealed passage adjacent to the main hall, marked on modern station maps as maintenance access. Restricted appears in none of Krasovsky's original plans. The masonry inside is inconsistent with 1900-era brickwork. It's older, harder, laid with mortar mixed to different ratios than standard Russian imperial specifications demanded. The corridor terminates at a bricked-up archway whose proportions are elliptical, with a ratio of 1.618 to 1. The golden ratio, a mathematical constant that some architectural researchers classify as a signature of hydraulic passages they attribute to Tartarian engineering. The archway's bricks are set in a different bond pattern than surrounding walls, suggesting they were added later to seal something that existed long before Krasovsky ever set foot on the construction site. So, consider what sits beneath and within this supposedly straightforward Russian industrial-era station, a sealed hydraulic chamber aligned to cardinal directions with fractional degree precision. Valve assemblies made from metal, too uniform for documented forging techniques. A dome whose blueprints call it decorative, but whose hidden skeleton could withstand siege-level loads. And a bricked-up golden ratio archway leading somewhere nobody in official capacity has wanted to explore. The official record insists this is all decoration and drainage, but decorative features don't require hydraulic pressure containment. Drainage tunnels don't align to cardinal points within fractions of a degree. And standard practice doesn't involve sealing chambers and mislabeling the records. Something was here before Krasovsky arrived, built into the bones of this place long before the first Russian railroad spike was driven. The question isn't whether something older exists beneath Paveletsky. The evidence says it does. The real question is how far it extends, and that answer was about to get much bigger than anyone expected. One anomaly is a curiosity. Two is a coincidence. But when the same impossible signatures start appearing across multiple structures, separated by hundreds of kilometers and decades of construction, coincidence stops being a credible explanation. The investigation into Paveletsky Station was never meant to expand beyond Moscow. It was supposed to be a single building with a few architectural quirks, interesting, maybe publishable, but contained. Then someone laid an 18th-century atlas next to a 19th-century railway development map, and the whole thing cracked wide open. The correlation between stations built during Russia's industrial boom and routes marked on Tartarian-era cartographic grids wasn't subtle. It wasn't approximate. It was immediate, precise, and deeply unsettling. Start with Yaroslavsky Station in Moscow. The official history says it was expanded in 1894, a practical project to accommodate growing passenger traffic. Standard stuff. But buried in the Russian State Railway Archive sits a planning memo from 1869, written by railway engineer Pavel Ryberg, that reads like no ordinary construction document. Ryberg instructed that all platform vaults must align with a central compass, rows marked on site, and warned in language that carries the weight of genuine anxiety. The deviation from this alignment compromises structural integrity in ways not yet understood. Read that again. Not in ways we prefer to avoid. Not in ways that reduce efficiency. In ways not yet understood. The engineer issuing this directive didn't know why the alignment mattered. He only knew it did, and he followed it anyway, as though working within constraints inherited from someone or something that came before him. Why would a railway station's structural integrity depend on alignment with a compass rose? And why would trained engineers obey a rule they couldn't explain? Beneath Yaroslavsky's platforms, excavation photographs from the 1894 expansion revealed iron conduits, massive cylindrical passages, 1.5 meters in diameter, running in cardinal directions toward adjacent city blocks. Material analysis conducted during a 1920s renovation found the iron was unusually uniform in composition, inconsistent with known 19th century forging techniques that typically produced metal with visible grain irregularities and carbon content variations. Official records dismissed these conduits as obsolete municipal drainage, but storm sewers of the 1890s were irregularly shaped, following terrain contours. These conduits were perfect cylinders, precisely horizontal, aligned to cardinal points with surveying accuracy that exceeded documented Russian engineering capabilities of the period. Drainage doesn't need to be perfect. Drainage follows gravity and convenience. Whatever these conduits were built for, it wasn't carrying rainwater away from train platforms. 600 kilometers northwest. Finland Station in St. Petersburg told the same story in a different accent. Completed in 1870 and expanded in 1904. Its renovation logs from 1908 mention the removal of corroded valve assemblies from sub-level passages. Origin unknown. The valve dimensions, visible in contemporary technical sketches, matched those documented at Paveletsky and Yaroslavsky. Circular flanges approximately 70 centimeters in diameter, with bolt patterns following geometric ratios, uncommon in Russian industrial manufacturing. The brick vaulting in Finland Station's substructure exhibited the same eerie precision observed in Moscow. Joints within millimeters of perfect level. Mortar mixed with aggregate ratios different from documented Russian imperial standards, and alignment with cardinal directions precise enough to serve as surveying benchmarks. Different city, different architects, different engineering firms. Same impossible precision. Same unexplained infrastructure hidden beneath the platforms. Then came Kazan Station, and things got stranger still. Officially completed in 1913, Kazan Station incorporates structural elements from an earlier building, dating to 1862. Archival drawings at the Moscow City Planning Archive revealed something curious. The 1913 renovation had been built around a central core that appears to predate Russian railway development entirely. Photographs from the 1862 construction phase show foundation crews encountering pre-existing stone chambers of what a contractor's report called exceptional masonry quality. Rather than demolish these mysterious chambers, the builders incorporated them, constructing the station's lower levels to align with openings and passages they could neither date nor explain. They didn't question what they'd found, they just built around it and kept going, as though some unwritten rule demanded accommodation rather than investigation. The 1913 expansion added Kazan Station's distinctive onion domes, the architectural elements that give the building its iconic silhouette. But measurements from archival photographs and later site examination revealed dome curvatures matching proportions documented at Paveletsky, radial supports spaced at precisely calculated intervals, iron reinforcement far heavier than decorative architecture required, and dimensions corresponding to dome structures photographed in 19th century surveys of Central Asian cities within historically Tartarian territories. The floor plan revealed geometric relationships characteristic of star fort layouts, radial symmetry, precise angular relationships between structural elements, and what some researchers describe as defensive depth, suggesting purposes well beyond passenger comfort. When digitized, station blueprints were overlaid with star fort diagrams from military engineering manuals published in France and Holland during the 18th century. The correspondence was remarkable. Kazan Station's structural geometry aligned with fortress design principles, documented in territories labeled Grande Tartarie on contemporary maps. A sealed corridor discovered during 1970s renovation work ran beneath the main hall and extended approximately 60 meters beyond the station's documented footprint. City engineers followed it until a collapse blocked further exploration. Their report noted that the passage was constructed with techniques and materials inconsistent with any recorded Russian construction period and recommended preservation but no further investigation. Preservation without investigation, the same institutional reflex documented at every other station. Don't ask what it is. Don't find out where it goes. Just note that it exists and seal the file. Now here's what happens when you stop looking at these stations individually and start looking at them together. The numbers become almost absurd in their consistency. Dome radii varied by less than 8% across all 4 stations. Remarkable uniformity for structures supposedly designed independently over 50 years by different architects in different cities. Foundation blocks at each site showed identical quarrying techniques and dimensions, clustering around a standard size of 2.4 by 1.2 by 0.8 meters. Conduit diameters were uniformly 1.5 meters, regardless of station size or passenger capacity. Vault alignments consistently followed cardinal directions with precision ranging from 0.1 to 0.4 degrees of deviation. These stations formed nodes on what appeared to be a geometric grid points, connected by straight-line relationships, extending hundreds of kilometers with angular precision, suggesting coordinated surveying on a continental scale. Contemporary Russian railway engineering from the 1860s to the 1910s exhibited no such coordination. Railway development was largely opportunistic, following economic demands and terrain constraints. Yet beneath this apparent improvisation lay geometric relationships suggesting deliberate planning at a scale that shouldn't have been possible without modern communication technology or adaptation to a grid that someone else had already established. Long before the first locomotive rolled across Russian soil, there's a particular kind of silence that settles over a cover-up. It's not the silence of ignorance. People who don't know something tend to be noisy about their confusion. This is the silence of people who found something, documented just enough to prove they found it, and then deliberately stopped talking. Between 1885 and 1920, something coordinated happened across Russian railway stations. Not construction, not renovation. Erasure. The evidence sits in plain sight, scattered across maintenance logs, renovation photographs, and work orders filed in archives from Moscow to Santina, Petersburg, if you know what you're looking for. The pattern starts at Paveletsky. A 1903 renovation photograph shows workers sealing a large iron valve assembly with concrete. The valve is massive, nearly a meter in diameter, and here's the detail that should make anyone pause. It shows no corrosion. None. The work order describes it as obsolete drainage apparatus from original construction. But if the valve dated to 1900, why would it show zero rust after only 3 years exposed to Moscow's damp sublevel conditions? Iron rusts. That's what iron does, especially underground, especially in a city built on river sediment. The metal's pristine condition suggested either metallurgical sophistication far beyond what Russian foundries could produce, or an age that the official timeline couldn't accommodate. Either explanation was inconvenient, so they poured concrete over it and moved on. Similar removals occurred at Yaroslavsky in 1894, Finland Station in 1908, and Kazan in 1914. The timing varied by decades, but the procedure remained strikingly consistent. First, workers conducting routine maintenance would discover chambers or mechanical elements not in any construction plan. Second, a brief notation would appear in the project log. Third, permanent sealing would follow without investigation. The bureaucratic language is where things get genuinely suspicious. Across different cities, decades, and engineering firms, the phrasing is almost identical. Apparatus of uncertain function removed per city directive. Lower chamber sealed for safety. Original purpose indeterminate. Valve assemblies dismantled and disposed. Engineering no longer relevant to modern operations. That's not independent contractors making independent decisions. That's coordinated institutional vocabulary phrasing from a template. A directive handed down from somewhere above individual station managers. This consistency across 35 years and multiple cities points towards something uncomfortable. Some institutional authority had systematically directed the concealment of these elements. When these erased components are mapped against Tartarian-era grids, they align with corridors connecting settlements documented on 18th-century atlases. The removals targeted specific nodes in what some researchers believe may have been a continent-spanning hydraulic or pneumatic network. The specificity of what was removed always, the valves, always the pressure fittings, always the sealed chambers suggests whoever ordered the erasure understood, at least partially, what they were dismantling. You don't surgically remove hydraulic valve assemblies from sub-level passages unless you know those assemblies matter. Ignorance doesn't produce that kind of precision. Knowledge does. One retired railway engineer adds a human dimension to all this institutional silence. Dmitry Vulov described discovering sealed chambers beneath Yaroslavsky during a 1967 expansion. The brickwork, he said, was like nothing he'd encountered, so precise you could not fit a razor blade between courses. Think about that. A razor blade. The kind of tolerance modern bricklayers would struggle to achieve with laser levels. And Vulov's orders? Fill it with concrete and forget about it. No investigation. No documentation beyond a brief project log mention. When asked why such craftsmanship wasn't studied, Vulov's answer carried weary pragmatism. Orders from above. The Soviet system did not encourage questions about pre-revolutionary infrastructure. Better to build over it than acknowledge it complicated our narrative of progress. That quote captures something essential. It wasn't just Tsarist Russia that chose concealment. The Soviet Union, a completely different political system, made the exact same choice. Two regimes that agreed on almost nothing both agreed on this. Whatever was down there, it was better buried than explained. The erasure extended beyond Russian borders. Helsinki Central Railway Station. Completed in 1919 by architect Eliel Saarinen, provided immediate parallels when construction photographs from 1914 to 1918 were examined at the Finnish National Archive. The same signatures appeared massive granite foundation blocks with precision jointing. Sealed sub-level chambers referenced obliquely in engineering reports. And dome structures matching Moscow's proportions. A 1916 engineering memo in Swedish described pre-existing stone vaults encountered during excavation, their origin predating Swedish or Russian administration of this territory, rather than investigating. Saarinen's team incorporated them into the foundation, the same accommodation without investigation approach, documented at every station where builders stumbled onto something they couldn't explain. The similarities between Helsinki and Moscow were too specific for stylistic influence alone. Helsinki's main hall dome measured 17.8 meters within 2% of Paveletsky's radius. Foundation blocks clustered around the same 2.4-meter standard. Accessible portions of Helsinki's substructure revealed granite with quarrying techniques identical to Moscow's smooth faces. Minimal tool marks, jointing so precise that mortar seemed decorative rather than structural. A sealed iron door in the lowest accessible level matched descriptions from Russian archives. Cast iron of unusual uniformity. Hinges and fittings, showing manufacturing precision inconsistent with early 20th century Finnish or Russian capabilities. Its corroded lock mechanism retained enough detail for comparison with valve assemblies at Russian stations. Identical bolt patterns, similar flange dimensions, the same geometric ratios governing structural placement. Overlaying Helsinki's location on Tartarian-era maps revealed it sat precisely on a north-south axis, connecting territories marked Eastern Tartary on 18th-century French atlases. The alignment was exact. The pattern had crossed an international border, jumped between political systems, survived the transition from Tsarist to Soviet governance, and still, at every point of discovery, the institutional response remained identical. Find it, note it, seal it, forget it. The erasure wasn't the work of one government, one ideology, or one era. It was something deeper, a reflex embedded in the very infrastructure of power itself, triggered every time someone dug too close to foundations that predated the stories nations tell about themselves. Every investigation reaches a moment where the individual threads stop being individual, where the strange detail at one site and the impossible measurement at another and the sealed door at a third stop, feeling like separate mysteries and start feeling like fragments of the same one. 9 months of research, 6 major railway stations, over 40 archival photographs, 23 sets of architectural blueprints, 16 renovation reports, and a database of measurements so internally consistent that the numbers almost argue the case by themselves. This is that moment, the point where the evidence either collapses under scrutiny or hardens into something that demands a very different conversation about what was really built across northern Eurasia. And by whom? The final survey meant revisiting each station for overlooked details. At Pavletsky, high-resolution photography of the main hall dome's interior revealed something hidden beneath layers of paint and plaster, faint geometric markings, precise radial lines and concentric circles that appeared to be surveying marks. And here's the problem. They seemed to predate the station's official construction in 1900. These weren't decorative flourishes consistent with Krasovsky's methods. They were older. They belonged to whatever occupied that site before the railway architects arrived with their blueprints and imperial ambitions. At Yaroslavsky, maintenance staff granted access to a sub-level passage sealed since 1967. The same passage Dmitry Vulov had described filling with concrete on orders from above. Behind a modern concrete wall, the original brick vaulting remained intact on several bricks. Something new emerged. Inscribed marks resembling Cyrillic characters, but predating the standardization of Russian orthography in the 18th century. A consulting historian suggested they resembled merchant marks from 17th century trade routes through Central Asia territories that contemporary maps labeled as parts of Tartaria at Finland Station. The closer examination of the sealed iron door yielded a detail initially mistaken for corrosion, a circular seal with radial divisions forming a geometric pattern compared to symbols documented in Tartarian architectural research. Matches appeared with merchant guild marks and hydraulic system identifiers from 18th century Central Asian structures. Not approximate matches. Specific ones, the kind of correspondence that makes stylistic coincidence feel like a desperate explanation. And then there was Kazan Station, where a long-time maintenance supervisor offered something no archive could provide. Workers, he said, occasionally heard sounds from sealed sub-level chambers, low-frequency vibrations occurring during heavy rain. His explanation was casual. Probably water pressure in old drainage pipes. But drainage pipes don't produce harmonic frequencies, and the sealed chambers had supposedly been filled with concrete decades earlier. If those chambers were truly solid, nothing should be resonating inside them. Something down there still responded to pressure. Something the concrete either hadn't fully reached or hadn't fully silenced. Each site visit added details that complicated rather than clarified. The infrastructure was more extensive, more precisely aligned, and more systematically concealed than initial documentation suggested. The erasure extended beyond physical infrastructure into documentation itself, into institutional memory, into official narratives that consistently minimized evidence of engineering sophistication predating Russian imperial capabilities. What was being hidden wasn't just old brickwork. It was the implication, the uncomfortable suggestion that someone had been here first. building things the 19th century couldn't replicate and the 20th century chose not to examine. By mid-December, the compiled database told a story the individual stations only hinted at. Dome radii across all documented stations fell within a 7.3% range, remarkable uniformity for structures supposedly designed independently over 50 years by different architects in different cities and, in Helsinki's case, a different country. Foundation blocks showed dimensional clustering around 3 standard sizes. Conduit diameters held at 1.5 meters, plus or minus 4 centimeters, regardless of station size. Stations aligned with each other along straight line axes, maintaining angular precision to within 0.3 degrees across distances exceeding 600 kilometers. These alignments corresponded to routes marked on Tartarian-era maps, the same maps European cartographers produced for over a century before the civilization they depicted quietly vanished from later atlases. When preliminary findings were presented at an architectural history conference, mainstream academics acknowledged the documented precision, but attributed it to standardization of railway practices during the late 19th century. A reasonable-sounding explanation until it hits the wall of sealed chambers and removed machinery. If these elements were standard engineering, why seal them rather than adapt them? Why systematically remove valve assemblies without documentation? Standard equipment gets upgraded. Standard equipment gets repurposed. Standard equipment doesn't get buried in concrete, while bureaucrats across multiple cities use identical language to describe its removal. The alternative that these stations incorporated infrastructure from an earlier, sophisticated civilization requires accepting something most historians are understandably reluctant to entertain. But reluctance isn't refutation. The physical evidence remains stubbornly inconsistent with purely 19th century construction. The precision exceeded documented capabilities. The coordination spanned distances impossible without modern communication. The concealment suggested institutional knowledge of something inconvenient to official histories. Picture Pavletsky Station on a January morning, winter light filtering through the dome's windows, illuminating a space Russian engineers built above chambers they chose not to understand. The iron hatch beneath Platform 3, corroded but intact, remains sealed, just as it has been since 1912. Whatever secrets the municipal authorities chose to conceal are still down there. Beneath the commuters and coffee vendors and announcement boards flickering with departure times, across Russia, across Finland, across territories that 18th century cartographers labeled before 19th century historians erased those labels. The pattern continues. Sealed chambers, removed hydraulic systems whose function no modern engineer can explain, architectural signatures repeated with mathematical precision across distances that should have made coordination impossible before the electronic age. The hypothesis emerging from 14 months of evidence can neither be proven conclusively nor dismissed comfortably. What we call 19th century Russian railway engineering may represent adaptation foundations inherited from a civilization that built with precision exceeding Victorian-era capabilities, coordinated construction across continental scales, and left mathematical signatures in stone from Moscow to the margins of Siberia. That civilization appeared on maps as Tartaria. Its architecture showed starfort geometries, golden ratio proportions, and hydraulic sophistication. Its disappearance from historical accounts coincided precisely with the period when stations were modified to conceal rather than preserve evidence of pre-existing systems. The archival gaps prevent certainty. The sealed chambers remain closed. But the architecture persists precise, aligned, whispering contradictions to the narrative that credits everything to 19th century innovation. The investigation is complete, the evidence is documented, and the pattern remains.